Michael Jackson stood at the window of his spacious home on the outskirts of the city. The evening sun shone on his face, casting long shadows on the walls of the living room. He looked out at the garden, where Alicia, his stepdaughter, was tending to the flowers. She seemed to be completely absorbed in her work, but Michael couldn't help but notice how her movements became calmer and more focused when she felt his eyes on her. His wife, Vanessa, was in the other room, preparing dinner. It was something routine on her part, but still new to Michael. After so many years of marriage, he could predict her every move, every word, but every time he looked at Alicia, he felt something completely different, an uncomfortable, heavy feeling that he tried to hide even from himself. Alicia raised her head and looked in his direction. Their eyes met. She smiled, but it wasn't the simple, carefree smile you give to your parents or close relatives. There was something else in her eyes, a temptation, a challenge, something almost forbidden. Michael froze for a moment. His heart beat faster, and he looked away. "Michael, will you help me with this?" Vanessa's voice brought him out of his thoughts. He slowly turned away from the window and walked to the kitchen, where Vanessa was setting out dinner plates on the table. Michael took one of them and put it on the table, trying to hide his mixed feelings. "What's wrong with you?" Vanessa looked at him intently. "You seem pensive today." "No, I'm fine," he replied, smiling. "Just a lot on my mind about work." Vanessa nodded, satisfied with his answer, and went back to her work. Michael breathed a sigh of relief, but his thoughts were already back at the window, where Alicia stood among her flowers. Alicia returned to the house a few minutes after the sun had disappeared behind the horizon. She quietly entered the kitchen, where the table was already set. Her mother was sitting at the table with a newspaper in her hands, and Michael was watching the news on TV as usual. They seemed like a perfectly normal family. "Sit down, dear. Dinner is ready," Vanessa said gently, not taking her eyes off the newspaper. Alicia sat down next to Michael, feeling his hand touch her arm for a moment as he passed her the bread. It was a simple touch, insignificant to any outsider, but to her it meant more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. "How was your day?" asked Michael, looking directly into Alicia's eyes. His voice was soft, but there was an underlying tension in it. "Not bad," Alicia replied, looking down, finding it difficult to maintain contact with his eyes. "I finished working in the garden." "You did a great job," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Alicia quickly glanced over at her mother to make sure she hadn't noticed their conversation, but Vanessa was busy reading and didn't notice anything suspicious. Later that night, when everyone had gone up to their rooms, Alicia stood by the mirror in her bedroom, looking at her reflection thoughtfully. She knew that these feelings she had for Michael were wrong, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore them. Their looks, their touches, all of it was becoming a part of her everyday life, and she was getting more and more immersed in it. She sighed, looking away from the mirror. She knew that something had to be done about it, but she didn't know what. Guilt and arousal were intertwined, confusing her even more. The next day was a normal work day. Michael went to his office, Vanessa went to a meeting with her friends, and Alicia stayed home. She decided to use this time to finish her chores in the garden. While working, she tried to distract herself from her thoughts, but it was impossible. All her thoughts revolved around Michael. Her internal struggle continued. She didn't know if she was just imagining their mutual feelings or if it was real. Suddenly, as Alicia was putting away the tools, she noticed Michael come home from work early. He walked across the garden, came up to her, and they locked eyes again. He didn't say a word, but she could read in his eyes what he couldn't put into words. "You came back early," Alicia said quietly, trying to hide her excitement. "Yeah, I decided to take the day off," Michael replied, the same tension in his voice again. They stood side by side in silence, and that silence spoke more than any words. Their connection was getting deeper, more forbidden, and they both knew it. But could they stop? At that moment, Alicia realized that this path could only lead them to trouble. Over the next few days, the situation only got worse. Michael and Alicia began to look for more and more opportunities to be alone. Their conversations became more and more frank, their touching more and more dangerous. Alicia knew it was all heading towards a precipice, but she couldn't stop herself. Alicia woke up to morning light barely penetrating the blinds on her bedroom windows. Lying in bed, she looked up at the ceiling, reflecting on everything that had happened in the past few days. Her relationship with Michael, which had begun as an innocent game, had now gone beyond what could be called safe. Every touch, every glance, every brief moment they had alone together only made what she was feeling worse. Alicia realized that this was all headed for disaster, but her body and heart were drawn to Michael, despite all the reasonable arguments she tried to give herself. A few hours later, she went downstairs for breakfast. Vanessa was already in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking on the phone with a friend. Her voice was light and carefree, which seemed almost painful against the backdrop of what was happening between Alicia and Michael. Her mother had no idea, and Alicia felt even more guilty for hiding such a huge secret. Michael appeared in the kitchen a little later. Their eyes met again, but this time he seemed reserved, silent. He still had the same hidden fire in his eyes, but he was now skillful at hiding it behind the routine. He approached Vanessa and kissed her lightly on the cheek. Vanessa smiled, unsuspectingly, and continued talking on the phone. Alicia turned her gaze to the plate in front of her, trying not to give away her emotions. "I'm going to need to leave for the office early today," Michael said, standing at the door. "I might be late coming back." "Alicia, could you do the shopping today while I'm gone?" Vanessa asked her daughter, still on the phone. "Sure," Alicia replied briefly, trying to ignore the way Michael walked away, barely meeting her eyes. It was too much like a game in which she was on a fine line. The day passed relatively quietly. Alicia tried to occupy herself with household chores, running errands for her mother, and hardly thought about Michael while he was away. However, her mind kept returning to his last words, to his behavior. He seemed more reserved than usual. Perhaps he too had begun to feel the tension, and realized that they were going too far. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, Alicia decided to return home after a long walk to the shops. She felt calmer, the fatigue in her body distracting her from her heavy thoughts for a while. However, when she opened the door to the house, she was confronted by Michael again. He had already returned home and was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee. He looked relaxed, but the flame that had fueled their relationship was still burning in his eyes. Vanessa was not at home. She had gone to her sister's house for a few days, which gave them the opportunity to be alone. "How was the shopping?" he asked, trying to sound neutral, but every word seemed burdened with a double meaning. "Fine," Alicia replied briefly, putting the bags on the table. They stood in silence for a few minutes, when suddenly Michael took a step closer. His hand touched her shoulder, and she felt again the same magnetic force that held them both captive. Alicia couldn't stop herself. She looked into his eyes, and this silence, this awkward silence that had become familiar to them, turned into something more. "We can't go on like this," she whispered softly, but her voice held little determination. It sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. "I know," Michael agreed, but his eyes said otherwise. He moved even closer, and there were only a few steps of distance between them. Alicia could feel her heart beating faster. She knew it was wrong, that it was leading them both to an inevitable tragedy, but something in her couldn't stop, and when Michael reached out and lightly touched her cheek, she didn't pull back. "We have to stop," she repeated, but again her words had no weight. Her breathing became faster, and she did not pull away from his touch. "I can't stop," Michael admitted. His voice was deep and intense, like a man on the brink of a cliff. The following days for Alicia were a continuous stream of doubts and contradictions. She tried to avoid Michael, but every time they met, even by chance, their bond deepened. Their conversations became shorter, but richer in subliminal innuendo. Their touches, even innocent ones, became dangerous. Vanessa returned home a few days later, unsuspecting. Her life seemed perfect, a loving husband, a caring daughter, a comfortable home. She often smiled, discussing trivialities with Michael, not paying attention to the changes in the behavior of her daughter and husband. Alicia often caught herself thinking that her mother didn't deserve to live a lie, but how could she ruin it all? Michael, on the other hand, acted as if nothing had changed. He was attentive to Vanessa. It seemed like he still loved her, But when he was alone with Alicia, all of that disappeared. His restraint became just a thin mask, hiding the passion and desire that had not disappeared. One night, when everyone had gone to bed, Alicia couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were confused, and her soul was torn apart by guilt. She knew they had gone too far, and she couldn't take it anymore. She decided to talk to Michael while there was still a chance to stop. But instead of putting an end to it, this conversation turned into another step into the abyss. She left the room and went to his door. She knocked, her heart pounding in her chest. Michael opened the door, and the same look in his eyes that had always stirred up all the things she had tried so hard to suppress appeared again. "We need to talk," she said, trying to look confident, even though she was seething with excitement inside. "What's wrong?" He stood in front of her in the silence of the night, his voice sounding calm, but again filled with the same emotion he was trying to hide. "We can't go on like this," she said firmly, although she didn't believe her words. Michael took a step forward, his hand barely touching her shoulder, and this made it clear to Alicia that there was no turning back. Over the next few days they continued to exchange fleeting glances and brief touches, but the tension between them was building. Michael and Alicia were trapped by their feelings. Alicia was sitting on the veranda, watching the evening sun gradually sink below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Her thoughts were tangled like knots that could not be untied. The last few weeks had turned her life into an endless struggle between desire and fear. Her relationship with Michael, the secret connection they kept, only made things worse. She felt that she could no longer hide it. Everything was out of control, and the tension inside her reached a critical point. Vanessa increasingly noticed changes in Alicia's behavior. The mother began to pay attention to how her daughter often looked away, avoided talking, and kept her distance. But Alicia did not have the strength to explain to her what was happening. Every step she took, every word became a trap from which there seemed to be no way out. Michael tried to behave as usual, especially in the presence of Vanessa. He plunged back into work, started coming home later, explaining that he was busy. But Alicia knew the truth. She could see how each of their brief encounters only made things worse. It seemed that the relationship between them, so tumultuous and unpredictable, had become a heavy burden for her that she could not bear any longer. That evening, when Alicia was alone at home, the thought came to her that she and Michael should break off the relationship. Her soul was burdened with feelings of guilt towards her mother, and she realized that it had to stop. But how? How could she stop something that was already so deeply rooted in her life? Michael came home later than usual. He entered the house in silence, trying not to draw too much attention to himself. But Alicia was waiting for him in the living room. She couldn't take it anymore. "We have to talk," she said, barely keeping the tension out of her voice. Michael stopped, his face darkening. He realized that this was not going to be an easy conversation. They both felt that this was headed for irreparable damage. "You're right," he agreed, sitting down on the couch. "We can't go on like this, but what do you suggest?" Alicia rubbed her hands nervously. She had already thought about how to stop this, but none of her ideas seemed right. "We have to end this," she whispered. "It's not right. We're hurting Mom. We're lying to her. And I can't live like this anymore." Michael was silent for a minute. His eyes were on the floor, and at that moment he seemed like a completely different person. Weak, confused. He had always been the one in control of the situation, but now he also felt like he was losing that control. "I know you're right," he finally said, looking up at Alicia. "But how? How do we stop it when we've already come this far?" This conversation did not bring them any relief. The tension only increased, and they both felt it. They were on the verge of something that had to end, and something that was still holding them together. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house became almost unbearable. Vanessa tried to behave as usual, ignoring the fact that Michael and Alicia had become estranged from each other. Her joyful conversations and constant optimism only increased Alicia's feelings of guilt. She could no longer look her mother in the eye. Michael also seemed restless. He often locked himself in his office, working late or leaving the house for long walks. His meetings with Alicia became short and tense. They no longer talked about what was happening between them, but every glance they made was imbued with hidden meaning. Alicia knew she had to do something. She could no longer live in such tension, and perhaps the only way out was to confess to her mother. But the thought seemed unbearable to her. How could she ruin the life of her mother, who had always been kind and caring to her? The evening of the incident was cold and dark. The sky was overcast with heavy clouds that promised rain. Alicia decided to go for a walk to clear her head and collect her thoughts. She walked along the quiet streets of the suburbs, thinking about what was to come. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but she also didn't know how to stop this nightmare. When she returned home, the house was quiet. Vanessa had gone to visit a friend, and Michael had disappeared even earlier, saying he had urgent business at work. Alicia walked through the dark rooms of the house and went up to her bedroom. She was already tired and thought only of resting, but as she approached her bed, she felt something strange. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw something on the floor beside her bed. A shoe. She turned and saw him. They started arguing. The next moment, darkness fell over her. Everything happened so fast that she did not have time to do anything. A strong blow stunned her, and she fell to the floor. Alicia saw nothing more. Her body went limp. In the morning, Alicia's body was found. The killer had left no obvious traces, and it looked like an ambush. No one knew who could have done it, but the house that once seemed so cozy and safe had now become a place where a secret was hidden, and everyone suspected each other. Michael returned home right after the police began their investigation. He looked stunned. Vanessa was crying. Her world had fallen apart. The detectives arrived the same day, and the investigation began with them interviewing everyone who had been involved with Alicia. Who was the killer? The morning after the murder was filled with heavy silence. There was an unsettling emptiness in the Jackson home, which usually exuded an atmosphere of comfort and security. Michael sat on the living room couch, nervously rubbing his hands together. His face was pale and his eyes were vacant. Vanessa sat next to him, clutching a handkerchief and continuously wiping away her tears. Everything that had happened was a shock to her. Her daughter was dead, and she could not understand the cause or the culprit. After Alicia's body was found, Detectives Henry and Sarah arrived at the scene. Henry was an experienced detective with years of practice, well known for his ability to notice details that eluded most others. Sarah was his junior partner, but over the years of working with Henry, she had learned to analyze situations as well as he did. They both entered the house, realizing that this murder would not be easy. There were still signs of a struggle in Alicia's room, although the detectives quickly realized that this was no ordinary robbery. There were no visible signs of violence on Alicia's body, other than the blow that proved fatal. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant that the killer was probably someone she knew. The door had not been damaged and the windows remained closed, ruling out the possibility of a random attack. Sarah began to look around the room, paying attention to all the little details. She stopped at a shelf with several family photos on it. They showed Alicia with her parents, but something about her expression seemed strange to Sarah. She looked tense, as if she was forcing herself to smile. Sarah made a note of this in her notebook and continued to examine the pictures. Henry, meanwhile, was examining the spot where Alicia's body was found. At first glance, everything looked clean enough, but one small detail caught his attention. Next to her body on the floor was a small piece of cloth that didn't match what Alicia had been wearing. He picked it up with tweezers and examined it carefully. "What is it?" asked Sarah, noticing that he had found something. "A cloth from a garment, but it's not hers," Henry replied, snapping his fingers as if trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. "Maybe it belongs to the killer." They took the piece of cloth to the lab for analysis, hoping to get at least some clues. After the forensic scientists finished their work, the detectives sat down with Michael and Vanessa to conduct their first interviews. Vanessa was in a broken state, her answers were short, and she often broke down in tears. She claimed that she knew nothing about what could have caused Alicia's death and had no idea who could have wished her harm. Michael, on the other hand, seemed more composed, although his nervous behavior was noticeable. He said that he had been at work the night of the murder, and when he returned home, Alicia was already dead. His voice was steady, But there was something more in his eyes, fear or guilt. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it. She noticed him avoiding looking at her directly during several questions, which struck her as suspicious. "Were you close to Alicia?" Henry asked, trying to understand their relationship. "She was like my own daughter," Michael replied, but his words sounded mechanical. Sarah noticed again how he nervously crumpled his napkin, and this only reinforced her suspicions. "Have you noticed any changes in Alicia's behavior lately?" asked Sarah, hoping to get at least some clue. Michael shook his head in the negative. "No, not really. She's been a little withdrawn lately, but that's been normal since she got home. She was just trying to find her place." Vanessa sat next to him, hands in her lap, silently crying. Her world had fallen apart, and she couldn't understand how her loving family could have been at the center of such horror. The next stage of the investigation was to interview witnesses and acquaintances of Alicia. One of the people the detectives decided to question was her old friend Ben. He and Alicia had known each other since college, and they had always kept in close touch. Ben looked stunned when he was invited to the police station. Ben sat across from Sarah and Henry, a little nervous. He had known Alicia for many years, and the thought that she could have been a victim of murder was unbelievable to him. "Have you known Alicia for a long time?" asked Sarah, trying to create a more comfortable atmosphere for the other person. "Yes, we met at university," Ben answered with a sigh. "She was a great friend. She always supported me, and I always supported her." "And have you been in touch lately?" Henry continued. "Yeah, but something's changed," Ben admitted, hesitating a bit. Sarah became interested. "What exactly?" "She's become more distant. We used to meet for coffee or just hang out a lot, but lately she's been avoiding me. I'd ask her if she was okay, but she'd never give me a clear answer. She always said that everything was fine, but I could tell that it wasn't." "Have you noticed any changes in her behavior or relationships with other people?" asked Sarah, listening carefully to every word. Ben was silent for a moment, thinking. "To be honest, I noticed that she started talking less about her family. She used to mention my mom a lot, but Michael, she never talked about him much. I don't know what happened between them, but it seemed like something was wrong." These words caught the detective's attention. Sarah wrote down these details in her notebook, which could have been a key point in the investigation. After interviewing Ben, the detectives returned to the Jackson home for an additional examination of the scene. They went through Alicia's belongings in her room, looking for any other clues that might shed light on her final days. Henry noticed one of the small details again: Alicia's phone. She had left it on the table, and the detectives decided to check its contents. Looking through the messages, they found several strange texts from an unknown number, some of which were quite intense. The content was such that it looked like someone was putting pressure on her. "Maybe it's someone who was involved in her death," Sarah suggested as she studied the messages. "It could be threats, or someone who was in conflict with her." "It's possible, but we don't know who it is yet," Henry replied, still thinking. They decided to send the phone for examination to try to identify the number and find a connection between this person and Alicia. In addition, the detectives made a request for call and text records in hopes of gaining more information. With each step in the investigation, the picture began to emerge, but it was still far from complete. Small details, like a piece of fabric, a message from an unknown number, and changes in Alicia's behavior provided clues, but the key to solving the mystery was still hidden. The detectives continued to work, realizing that the truth was somewhere nearby. It was hiding in the little things that would eventually come to the surface. Detectives Henry and Sarah were sitting in their office discussing the investigation. Weeks had passed since Alicia's murder, but they still didn't have enough evidence to pinpoint a specific suspect. The only thing they had was circumstantial evidence and the feeling that the clue was out there. Sarah looked over her notes, trying to get the big picture. "Michael, the stepfather, is clearly hiding something," she said. "I'm sure he knows more than he's telling. His behavior during the interrogations was too nervous, especially when we touched on his relationship with Alicia." Henry nodded. "That's possible, but his behavior doesn't mean he's the killer. He may just be trying to hide something else. However, we can't ignore the fact that they had some kind of relationship." We need to check it out." "You think they might have been having an affair?" asked Sarah, tilting her head to the side. "It's quite possible," Henry replied, picking up the files on Michael. "We need to ask more people, especially those who might have been close to them. We've already heard from Ben that Alicia was having problems with Michael, but whether it was because of the affair or something else is unclear." The next morning, the detectives decided to re-interview several people, including Michael's friends and colleagues, to learn more about his relationship with Alicia. One of the first people they called was the family's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She lived next door to the Jackson family and often witnessed what went on behind closed doors. "Mrs. Henderson, did you know the Jackson family well?" asked Henry, sitting in front of the elderly woman who was looking nervously at the detectives. "Oh, of course. I've known them all for years," she replied, hugging her purse to her. "I always thought they were the perfect family. Well, at least on the surface." "What do you mean?" asked Sarah, leaning forward to listen more closely. "You know, Alicia, she's always been such a sweet girl, but lately, I've been noticing that something has been off between her and Michael. They were fighting a lot," said Mrs. Henderson. "I've seen her come out of the house crying several times after talking to him." "Do you think there were any personal problems between them?" Henry clarified, trying to find out more. Mrs. Henderson shrugged her shoulders. "Well, I can't say for sure, but it seemed strange. Michael has always been a good husband, but with Alicia, their relationship has become very strained in the last few months. I thought it was because of her coming home, but now, I'm not so sure." The detectives exchanged glances. These words confirmed their suspicions that the relationship between Michael and Alicia might have been more complicated than it seemed at first glance. After interviewing Mrs. Henderson, the detectives decided to return to Michael for a more detailed questioning. This time, they were not going to avoid sensitive topics. Michael looked exhausted when he entered the interrogation room. His face was exhausted, his eyes dark, as if he hadn't slept in days. He sat down at the table and sighed heavily, waiting for the conversation to begin. "Michael, we know that you had a strained relationship with Alicia," Sarah began bluntly, "and we suspect that they were more than just family issues." Michael looked away and seemed to go even paler for a few seconds. He was silent, trying to collect himself. "What are you trying to say?" he finally replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We suspect you were having an affair with Alicia," Henry said. "We've spoken to several people, and they all confirm that you had some sort of personal relationship." Michael shivered, his hands moved nervously, and he leaned back. He knew that it was useless to keep hiding it. "Yes, we had an affair," he finally admitted, lowering his head. "I never planned for it to happen, but it just happened. I don't know how to explain it. I felt something more than just paternal feelings for her, and she couldn't stay indifferent either. But I swear I didn't kill her." Sarah and Henry listened attentively, noting every detail in their notes. This confession was important, but it did not mean that Michael was the killer. "How long had this been going on?" asked Sarah, trying to get a sense of how deep their relationship had gone. "A few months," Michael answered with a sigh. "We tried to stop, but we couldn't. It was wrong, I know it. Vanessa didn't suspect anything, and that made it even worse. I felt guilty every day." "Why didn't you come clean sooner?" Henry continued. "It could have helped you earlier." "I was afraid," Michael answered quietly. "I knew this could destroy my family, and I was ready to stop everything. I didn't kill her. I would never do that, even though we had a relationship." The detectives exchanged glances. This confession cast doubt on Michael's role as the killer, but many questions remained. After interviewing Michael, the detectives decided to return to examine the evidence, including a piece of cloth found at the crime scene. The lab confirmed that it was a piece of men's clothing, but it did not match any of Michael's known samples. This led detectives to consider other possible suspects. Finally, after further testing, it turned out that the fabric matched the clothes worn by Ben, an old friend of Alicia's. Henry and Sarah were shocked when they received this information. Ben had always seemed like such a close and loyal friend, but something about this situation now looked suspicious. "We need to talk to Ben again," Sarah said when they received the test results. "Maybe he's not as innocent as he seemed at first glance." Ben appeared for questioning again, this time clearly more tense than during previous conversations. Sarah started the conversation, calmly but firmly. "Ben, we have new evidence that indicates that you were at the crime scene the night of Alicia's murder. The piece of cloth found near her body belongs to you." Ben turned pale. His hands began to tremble as he tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. "It can't be," he whispered. "I couldn't have." "We know you were close friends," Sarah continued. "But what happened between you? You were at the scene that night. Why didn't you tell us this before?" Ben trembled even more, and suddenly his restraint began to crumble. I didn't mean to," he finally admitted. "I didn't want it to happen, but I just couldn't take it." "Couldn't take what?" asked Henry, leaning forward. "I loved her," Ben said, his voice filled with despair. "I'd been in love with Alicia for years, but she never saw me the way I wanted her to. And then I found out about her and Michael. I couldn't stand it. How could she choose him over me?" Sarah and Henry exchanged brief glances. That was the motive. "That night I went to talk to her. I came in through the back door of the house, which was open," Ben continued, his voice growing increasingly distraught. "I wanted her to end it, but she refused. We started arguing, and I lost control." "Did you kill her, Ben?" Henry asked quietly. Ben covered his face with his hands and nodded, beginning to sob. "It was an accident. I hit her with a bronze statue. I didn't mean for it to happen. But she died." The detectives listened in silence as Ben confessed to the murder. The motive of jealousy became clear: his love for Alicia, which remained unrequited, and his anger over her relationship with Michael led to the tragic outcome. Ben was arrested the same day. Ben's arrest brought a long-awaited conclusion for the detectives, but not for the Jackson family. When the real killer was identified, everything fell into place. But it didn't lessen the pain Vanessa experienced. Her world had fallen apart. Her beloved daughter was dead, and the truth about the relationship between Alicia and Michael was no less a tragedy. Michael sat in his office, looking at the photo of Alicia on his desk. He knew that their relationship was doomed, but he could not have predicted that it would end so violently. Now he could only live with the guilt of deceit, of failing to protect her, and of taking an innocent life because of him. When Vanessa found out about the affair, she packed her things and left the house. She could no longer be with the man who betrayed her in the worst possible way. Her heart was broken into thousands of pieces, and she didn't know if she would ever be able to forgive Michael. Michael was left alone with his pain and sense of loss that nothing could drown out. He tried to convince himself that maybe with time the pain would dull, but he knew it wasn't true. Every day of his life would be a reminder of what had happened, and he would carry that burden for the rest of his life. Detectives Henry and Sarah wrapped up the case, but their thoughts kept returning to this investigation for a long time. They had seen a lot over the years, but this story left a deep mark. Jealousy, forbidden love, betrayal, all of this eventually led to death. And although justice was served, the feeling of bitterness still remained. Sarah thought about how small details can sometimes be the key to uncovering the truth. A piece of fabric that seemed insignificant at first glance led them to the killer. Every step in the investigation, every little thing mattered. Henry, who had always been a pragmatist, kept thinking about Ben. He could not understand how deep, hidden jealousy could lead to such a cruel act. The people they questioned described Ben as a kind, calm man, but everyone has a dark side that can manifest itself at any time. Ben was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Alicia. He could not forgive himself for what he had done. Jealousy and unrequited love led him to a crime from which there was no turning back. In his cell, he spent most of his time in silence, reflecting on his actions and the fact that he had lost everything: his girlfriend, his life, and his humanity. When the case was closed and the city gradually returned to normal life, the memories of Alicia remained painful. She was a young woman with great potential, but her life was cut short because of unforgivable human mistakes. Her story became a reminder of how easy it is to lose everything because of wrong decisions, jealousy, and betrayal. Life moved on, but for those who knew and loved Alicia, this pain remained forever. And although the truth was revealed, the losses that this investigation brought could not be undone.